Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're diving into a really fascinating thinker, Jacques Lefèvre de Table. He was born around 1450, a philosopher, started at the University of Paris, ended up being a really key figure in biblical studies, religious reform, that sort of thing. But before all of that, Lefèvre took some pretty crucial intellectual journeys, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And these trips weren't just your typical academic pilgrimages. Lefebvre was deliberately going after the big names in Italian humanism. I'm talking folks like, Ermolao Barbaro, Pico della Mirandola, Ficino, Poliziano. I mean, these were like the rock stars of Renaissance thought.
Yeah, he went right to the source.
Exactly. He wanted to absorb their fresh approaches to scholarship and bring those methods back to Paris, hoping to shake up the way philosophy was being taught in the stuffy old university system.
And it seems like when he got back, he was, incredibly prolific. He just turned out all these works, introductions, commentaries, you name it, covering just crazy range of topics: mathematics, natural magic, logic, natural philosophy, ethics, metaphysics. He did it all.
He really did. And what makes Lefebvre so interesting, I think, is that he was working as a humanist inside the university. I mean, he wasn't some outsider critic. His whole project was about reforming philosophy from within. And for him, that meant going back to the original texts. And when he said original texts, he really meant Aristotle.
So a hardcore Aristotelian, huh?
Yeah, you could say that. And I think, for anyone listening who's interested in getting a handle on big philosophical shifts and getting there quickly, thoroughly, I think Lefebvre is a great case study in how going back to the roots can really unlock new understanding.
So the mission for our deep dive today is pretty clear. We're going to unpack Lefebvre's approach to philosophy. We'll try to figure out what made his method tick and why he's still considered such an important figure in Renaissance thought.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, let's start with his teaching style. I mean, he was known for a very distinctive approach to pedagogy, wasn't he?
Absolutely. One of the big things Lefebvre pushed was this idea of the epitome, like as a philosophical style. Think of it as a move towards clarity. Instead of those dense, complicated scholastic debates and questions, the kind of stuff that dominated university philosophy, Lefebvre was all about commentaries, paraphrases, carefully edited editions, all designed to make philosophy more accessible.
So less of the intellectual gymnastics and more of a straight path to the core ideas.
That's a good way to put it. Lefebvre wanted to, as he put it, draw up and taste the purest waters from the very spring of Aristotle's works. He truly believed that by going straight to Aristotle, no-filter students would get a much clearer, much more authentic understanding.
So how did he put this into practice?
Well, he created these handbooks, basically concise explanations of key terms, basic concepts, stuff to prepare students to tackle Aristotle head-on. He didn't want them getting lost in all the commentary that had piled up over the centuries.
That's pretty student-centered for the time. So what did these handbooks actually look like?
They were pretty innovative, structurally. Often, Lefebvre would start with a synoptic table, kind of like a visual overview of the whole work, an intellectual map for the student. Then he'd follow that up with paraphrases, breaking down Aristotle chapter by chapter, making it easier to digest. And he'd include these nota, his own little side comments. They could be philological, historical, or just focused on key points. And sometimes, to really mix things up, he would even include dialogues, imaginary conversations between a teacher and student working through the material.
Wow, so it sounds like he was really dedicated to making these tough texts approachable, really thought about how students would learn best.
Yeah, no doubt about it. But his big goal, his real ambition, was to create what he called an encyclopedic Aristotle. Basically, a complete, systematically organized, easy-to-use presentation of, all of Aristotle's thought. And this goal seems to have been shaped by his time in Italy. Remember those rock stars we talked about? Well, he had a chance to actually learn from them firsthand.
Oh, right, those Italian humanists. So how did those guys influence his vision of this encyclopedic Aristotle?
Well, for example, Barbaro, he'd been pushing for this idea of making all of Aristotle's work accessible to students, not just in pieces, but as a unified whole. And Lefebvre clearly took that to heart. Then there's Poliziano. When Lefebvre's in Florence, Poliziano was giving these lectures on Aristotle, and he had this interesting approach. He emphasized explaining both the arguments and the exact meaning of the words res e verba, as they said.
So kind of like a close reading approach, paying attention to both the content and the specific language?
Exactly. And Poliziano argued that this grammarian's approach, one rooted in understanding the Greek language, would give you a truer picture of Aristotle than just purely philosophical interpretations.
So Lefebvre picked up this idea of focusing on both content and language, but did he just follow Poliziano's lead, or did he put his own spin on things?
He definitely adapted it. Poliziano was mostly concerned with the nitty-gritty of the Greek language, but Lefèvre took a broader approach. He wanted to reconstruct Aristotle's philosophy systematically as this complete intellectual system. And really importantly, he wanted to show that Aristotle's thought actually fit with Christian doctrine. He was trying to bridge that gap between ancient philosophy and Christian belief.
Okay, so we've got pedagogical reform, the quest for the encyclopedic Aristotle, and trying to make Aristotle play nice with Christianity.
Right.
Now, how about Aristotle's actual philosophical method? How did Lefebvre deal with that, and what about all the different philosophical schools that were around back then?
Right, so this part's especially juicy for us philosophy nerds. Lefebvre's argument was basically this. Aristotle's own method, that should be the model for doing philosophy, not the methods that later Aristotelians came up with, or all those medieval philosophical schools, the realists versus the nominalists and so on. He wanted to bypass all that baggage.
So going right back to the source for method, too.
Yeah, exactly. And he was pretty critical of some of the stuff that was being taught in logic back then, like those super complex logical exercises, sophismata, exponabilia, insolubilia, all those brain-twisting puzzles.
Yeah, the stuff that makes you wonder if you're actually learning anything useful.
Right. He thought those were distracting people from the real work of philosophy, which for him meant grappling with Aristotle's texts directly.
I know he even put together his own edition of Aristotle's logical works, right?
He did, in 1503. And it was a big deal. He offered a corrected text of the standard Latin translations. But the commentary was all about getting at what Aristotle actually meant, not getting bogged down in what later commentators had to say. Lefebvre felt like previous generations, even though they'd studied logic like crazy, had gotten sidetracked by, irrelevant stuff.
So clarity and fidelity to the original source, those were his guiding principles in terms of method.
Totally. And on top of that, Lefebvre was also really big on the idea that different academic disciplines are distinct. He was always pointing to Aristotle's concept of metabasis. That's basically the fallacy of taking a conclusion from one field and applying it to another where it doesn't belong. Lefebvre believed each discipline, logic, math, metaphysics, each had its own territory, its own way of thinking. And his textbooks often reflected this. He would divide subjects up very carefully, sometimes even using those synoptic tables to give students a visual representation of the structure.
So super organized, everything in its place.
Very much so. But he also realized that these disciplines weren't totally isolated. He thought there were analogical relationships connecting them. He believed the unique method of each discipline could actually be a springboard to a higher level of understanding.
Okay, so there's some unity in there somewhere.
Yeah, definitely. Lefebvre and his students were always talking about traces, vestigia, or analogy that hinted at a deeper unity behind all the seeming differences.
That's fascinating. This idea of analogy as a bridge between different fields, it's pretty powerful, especially if you're trying to find a worldview that hangs together.
Well, absolutely. And this fascination with analogy is probably why Lefebvre was so into math. After all, ancient number theory, it was all about ratios, proportions, the very essence of analogical relationships. For Lefebvre, analogy could mean a strict mathematical proportion, but it could also be a broader similarity between different subjects. He even thought that mathematical reasoning, could help you rise to divine matters. He once praised math for offering quicker, more abstract, purer analogies for rising to divine matters.
So math wasn't just for calculating stuff, it was a way of seeing fundamental connections in reality.
Exactly. And it's worth remembering that in the 16th century, the word Methodist, it often meant something like a shortcut or even a textbook. And those were the kinds of tools Lefebvre was building. His student Guillaume Gontier actually called Lefebvre's logic introductions a method that would quickly get students to the port of the disciplines. Among Lefebvre's students, his manuals were basically the way to study philosophy seriously. And Lefebvre himself, he was seen as the model for this new, more direct, more efficient style of thinking.
It's funny how he was trying to get past all the established schools of thought, and he ended up, basically creating his own school, the Fabrists, as they're sometimes called.
Right. There's definitely some irony there.
Yeah.
Lefebvre wanted his introductions to give students direct access to Aristotle. No need for all the scholastic commentary. But those introductions themselves, they became objects of intense study, reproduction, commentary. It's like, even though he wanted to avoid it, the Fabrist ended up forming their own path, a new via, on that ever-changing map of Renaissance philosophy. It shows you, I guess, that people will always form communities around influential thinkers, even when the thinker's saying, hey, don't make a school out of me.
Okay, so we've covered the pedagogical reforms, the approach to method, the whole back to the source thing.
Right.
Now let's dig into some of the big themes in Lefèvre's work, starting with logic.
All right, so in logic, Lefèvre is part of this humanist movement that was trying to, simplify, clarify the discipline, trying to get away from what they saw as, as the needless complexity of scholastic logic. Think of people like Lorenzo Valla, Rudolf Agricola, later Peter Ramus. They were all working towards a logic that was more in line with the way words are actually used, how they connect to the real world.
And he really went after the standard logic curriculum, didn't he? That whole old logic versus new logic thing, that seems pretty key to understanding what he was up to.
Totally. The standard stuff was based on the old logic of Achates, basically what they inherited from late antiquity. It was mainly Boethius's translations and commentaries on Aristotle's categories and on interpretation, plus Porphyry's Isagoge.
Right.
And then, from the 12th century on, you had the new logic, Logica Nova. This included stuff that had been rediscovered or translated, like Aristotle's prior analytics, topics, sophistic refutations. And by the late 15th century, students were usually learning this stuff from textbooks, like Peter of Spain's Summul Logicalis. It was the logic textbook.
So, super influential.
Hugely. But Lefèvre, like other humanists, he had some serious problems with this Logico-Modernorum. His own logical introductions, they were meant to be a much more streamlined alternative to the Summul, which could get, pretty long and convoluted.
So where did his edition of Aristotle's logical works fit into all this?
Well, unlike some humanists, like Valla, who basically wanted to chuck the new logic altogether, Lefèvre was more interested in clarifying and, I guess you could say, purifying the foundations of the old logic. He defined logic, following Agricola, as disciplina discerendi, the art of reasoned discourse. And he divided logic into three parts: colloquia, judgment, and invention. The first part, proloquia, that was heavily based on the logic of Vedas. It focused on how we classify things based on their substance and qualities, using these meaningful propositions or proloquia. The second and third parts, those dealt with argumentation, judgment, which came from Aristotle's prior analytics, and the methods for finding stuff to argue about, invention, based on the topics and sophistic refutations.
It sounds like he was really focused on that first part, the proloquia. Why so much emphasis on that?
Yeah, that's a good catch. While he acknowledged the importance of the other parts of logic, he really did spend a lot of time on the pars proloquendi. And proloquium, that term, had a double meaning for him. Sometimes it just meant introduction, but he also used it in a more technical sense to refer to an axiom, a foundational principle of demonstration.
So the starting point for building knowledge.
Right. And in his commentary on Aristotle's posterior analytics, he explicitly connected the idea of first principles, the things you need for a valid demonstration, with these proloquia. His focus on the logic of Vedas, it came from this deep desire to ground knowledge in solid, self-evident starting points. He thought the Logica Modernorum and even the more rhetorical parts of Aristotle's Organon, like the Topics, which is all about dialectical reasoning, he thought those were based on less certain premises. He saw them as leading to, kind of sophistic debates, good for maybe shaping opinions, but not for establishing rock-solid knowledge, what he called scientia.
So he's drawing a line between opinion and certain truth.
Yeah, exactly. He saw dialectic as useful for, intellectual exercise, discussions, philosophical inquiry in general, but he thought it was more like sparring, than a way to reach unshakable knowledge. And unlike some other humanists who really emphasized the everyday rhetorical side of logic, Lefèvre was all about those fundamental principles, those principia or proloquia that form the bedrock of good reasoning. And this focus on getting a clear, immediate grasp of those principles, it's tied to his pedagogical goals, of course, but it's also connected to, remember, his belief in a harmonious, analogically structured universe.
Right. Everything fits together. Okay, now let's move on to a really big one, the question of universals. Sometimes Lefèvre gets labeled as a nominalist, but it sounds like his position was more complicated.
It definitely was. Calling Lefèvre a simple nominalist, that's just way too simplistic. I mean, yes, he wrote this little introduction to Peter of Spain's Summul Logicalis, and there are some student notes where he says the nominalist position is vera et pulchra, true and beautiful.
Sounds like he was leaning that way.
Well, maybe, but we got to remember, His main goal with the introductions was to help students work through and ultimately move beyond the complexities of that new terminus logic. So it might just be that he was, kind of dissatisfied with those approaches. It doesn't necessarily mean he was a full-blown nominalist.
So again, he's trying to find a middle ground.
He's a master of the via media, the middle way. You see this all over Lefèvre's work. Like in his notes on Porphyry's isagoge, he's really critical of two extreme ways of thinking about Aristotle's category of substance. On the one hand, you have people who focus only on individual things, and they neglect the underlying concepts. On the other hand, you have people who are obsessed with abstract concepts, but lose sight of the actual things those concepts are supposed to represent. Lefèvre thought neither of these extremes would get you to a real understanding of Aristotle.
So where did he turn for a better approach?
Well, he was really into Boethius, just like many thinkers of the period, and he found Boethius's approach to the problem of universals very insightful. Boethius, in his commentaries on the Isagoges, said that the human mind, it abstracts universals from concrete reality by seeing the shared likeness, the similitudo, in individual things.
So we see a bunch of dogs, and we recognize dogness as something they share.
Right, something like that. And Boethius went on to say that universals, understood this way as mental abstractions based on real similarities, well, they have a kind of separate, non-physical reality of their own.
So they're not just names we give to things.
Exactly. And Lefèvre, he was definitely influenced by this Boethian perspective. He knew that Porphyry, in the Isagoge, had deliberately dodged the question of whether genera and species really exist. He said that was a matter for metaphysics. But Lefèvre's commentary, it shows that he was leaning towards a moderate realism, a lot like what Boethius had articulated.
So universals are real, but they're not like floating around out there independent of the things they represent.
You got it. And there's this great little dialogue he includes in his notes on Aristotle's categories. It's called Dissertatio de Universali, a debate about the universal. In it, some students of Chrysippus are arguing about universals. And their conclusion is very Boethian, they say, that the mind adds something conceptual to both the thing and the word that signifies it. One of the students even says, therefore, when I give the name man and look at the thing itself, I do so with an addition, namely of the universal, by reason.
So the mind is doing some heavy lifting there. Any other examples of this moderate realism in his work?
Oh yeah, a good one is from his commentary on Aristotle's category of quantity. He talks about the difference between counting number numerantia and counted number numerato. This distinction comes from Aristotle's physics. But Lefèvre uses it to argue that numbers, as universals, they're more than just mental constructs. He throws in a third category, numbers themselves, numeri, as distinct concepts, rations of counting. He says there's a fundamental unity between the unit in your mind when you're counting and the actual unit in the world.
So the mental act of counting and the thing being counted, they share something.
Right. He argues that true numbers are gathered and composed from units in a way that goes beyond both just mental stuff and the limits of the physical world. So again, he's saying that universals aren't just names, but they're real intellectual notions, concepts that bridge the gap between hardcore realism and nominalism.
He really does like to carve out his own intellectual space, doesn't he? Whether it's logic or the question of universals, he's taking bits and pieces from different traditions, but he's always adapting, synthesizing, making it his own.
Definitely. Okay, so let's switch gears and talk about natural philosophy. Lefèvre did those paraphrases of Aristotle's works on this stuff pretty early in his career. And I know Themistius was a big influence. What were some of the hallmarks of his approach to understanding the natural world?
Yeah, he was really trying to get Aristotle's own thought, but there are some things that stand out, some methodological choices that are, kind of uniquely Lefèvre.
Definitely. One thing is, he often talks about natural philosophy in terms of its goals. He's not just interested in analyzing the pieces, He's thinking about the big picture, the role of these disciplines within a larger philosophical system.
So he's got this teleological view, thinking about the purpose of natural philosophy.
Yeah, and that sometimes got him in trouble. Some people thought he was getting too mystical. But when you look closely, he's actually really careful about keeping different fields separate. For example, in his commentary on Aristotle's physics, he tackles this big question of the origin of all things. But he doesn't bring in any theological explanations. He explicitly says that kind of stuff belongs to first philosophy or metaphysics, and it should be handled there. He's not going to mix up the methods and subject matter of natural philosophy with, metaphysics or theology.
So he sees the connections, but he's rigorous about the boundaries.
Exactly. But he did believe that studying nature carefully, it could reveal traces of the divine. And he thought philosophy, as a whole, should lead students toward contemplating those higher realities. And you see this in his dialogue on the introduction to the physics.
Wow.
They're discussing the physical elements, and then they go on this big digression about the great chain of being. They end up saying that the best thing humans can do is contemplate heavenly realities. The teacher in the dialogue, he summarizes the goal of philosophy this way: to prepare us from the correct notion of sensible things, to enter the intelligible world, and hence, to know our blessed place.
Wow, so it's almost like natural philosophy is it's the first step in this larger intellectual and even spiritual journey.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to see it. But that journey still involves a really careful study of the physical world. And another interesting thing Lefèvre does is he uses mathematical examples, to shed light on Aristotelian concepts. This is pretty unique. In his dialogues on physics, especially the introductory dialogue on difficult physics, he's dealing with some tough questions about quantity, how it relates to ideas like matter, weight, the intention and remission of qualities, how qualities change in intensity. And he uses points, lines, ratios to make these abstract concepts clearer. One of the characters in the dialogue even says he's amazed to be learning how to philosophize about qualities through quantities.
That does sound kind of groundbreaking for the time. How was he actually using math in these discussions?
We'll take the intention and remission of qualities. This was a big topic in medieval philosophy. How do qualities become more or less intense? Lefèvre seems to have thought that qualities get more intense when you add parts or degrees to them. And he thought that contrary qualities in the same object, they can only get so intense. He even gives this quasi-geometrical argument. He uses the analogy of two scales representing hot and cold to show how you could apply quantitative reasoning to qualities. Okay, so trying to bring a kind of mathematical precision to the study of qualities.
In a way, yes. But it's important to remember he wasn't trying to reduce qualities to just mathematical things. He was using math as a tool to illustrate, to make Aristotle's ideas about physics easier to grasp. And it's interesting because Lefèvre was actually pretty critical of the calculators, those 14th century thinkers who used a lot of math in their natural philosophy.
So he wasn't a fan of those guys. Well, it wasn't the math itself he had a problem with. It was more about how they presented their ideas. He thought they relied too much on sophismata, those logical puzzles. He saw those as, kind of a distraction from trying to give a true account of nature. He seemed to think his own use of math was different.
So what was different about it?
He was trying to use math to get at a genuine representation of the natural world. And one influence on this might have been the Albertists. They were pretty big in Paris in the 15th century, and they were really into using math to understand the physical world. They were kind of a counterpoint to the nominalists and the calculators. And there are some interesting parallels between Lefèvre and the Albertists when it comes to their theories about the mind. They both thought math was crucial for training your ability to think abstractly. Lefèvre even said that the soul is uniquely able to rationally measure the corporeal world in abstract terms.
So, we can use math to get at the essence of physical things.
Right. And the Albertists, they were influenced by Neoplatonists like Pseudo-Dionysius and Themistius, and they believed that the intellect could think about separate, immaterial objects without needing sensory images. Lefèvre doesn't come out and say he agrees with them and is on the soul, but he leaves the possibility open. He says that separable objects are considered in the same way that they exist. For if they exist entirely separate from matter, then matter is entirely irrelevant in considering them. In his commentator, Klichtov, he actually expands on this. He talks about modes of intellection that go beyond the senses, and he uses mathematical objects as the prime example.
So, we can think about a perfect circle, even though we've never seen a perfect circle in the real world.
Yeah, that kind of thing. So Lefèvre's bringing together all sorts of influences in his natural philosophy. He's definitely engaging with the new translations of Greek commentators like Themistius. For example, Themistius uses light imagery to talk about the active and passive intellect, and there are some similarities with what Lefèvre says, even though he doesn't cite Themistius directly. In the end, his view of the mind puts him in a tradition that includes people like Ramon Lull and Nicolas Cusa. They were all open to Platonic ideas about universals and using math as a way to understand how the mind works.
Okay, so let's switch to moral philosophy. It seems like Lefèvre really made his mark here with his commentaries on Aristotle.
Yeah, this is where he really went deep.
Yeah.
Remember how he liked epitomes and paraphrases in other areas? Well, for moral philosophy, he wrote full-blown, detailed commentaries on Aristotle's ethics, economics, and politics. Plus, he had his own little work, the ars moralis.
So he took ethics seriously. 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 He also did something really important. He published a single volume that included the new, more accurate translations of the Nicomachean Ethics by Argyropoulos and Bruni, along with the older, less accurate one by Robert Grosseteste. So you had all these different versions side by side. And that's seen as a really key moment in humanist moral philosophy because it encouraged people to compare and contrast different interpretations.
So not just presenting Aristotle, but also fostering critical engagement with different translations and approaches.
Exactly. And he didn't just present Aristotle in a vacuum. He brought in other intellectual and even cultural elements. Like many Renaissance thinkers, he started his ethics with this idea of man as microcosm. Humans are like a mini version of the whole universe. He thought ethical behavior meant striving for harmony with God and nature. And that harmony was supposed to be reflected in how human communities were organized and run. Some scholars even argue that Lefèvre was promoting more contemplative, monastic ideal of humanism, rather than the civic humanism that was more focused on political engagement. Interesting. So how did he actually present Aristotle's ethics?
He followed Aristotle's structure pretty closely in his early introduction. He talked about virtues as habits, things you acquire through practice. He went through different types of goods. He gave definitions of virtue and duty. Like he said, virtue is the habitus of the soul perfecting itself and directing its work to the good. Duty is the action of virtue. And then he went on to discuss all the moral virtues, the intellectual virtues, heroic virtue, and finally contemplative happiness. And on that last point, he was trying to find common ground between Aristotle and Christian theology.
So finding that overlap between ancient ethics and Christian teachings.
That's right. And one way he did that was by using examples from Roman poets like Horace, Virgil, Ovid. He'd show how the virtues of these, virtuous pagans, how they anticipated Christian morality. For example, he connected the Pythagorean and Roman ideals of chastity with the Christian virtue of temperance. And he used stories from Ovid and Livy to illustrate this. And then he'd contrast those ideals with examples of, lack of self-control from Virgil. Sometimes he'd even tweak Aristotle's ideas to fit a Christian perspective. Like when he's talking about pleasure in the ethics, he brought in that image of Jesus rebuking hypocrites from the New Testament. And he stressed the importance of matching your words and actions if you want to be truly virtuous. He said, the simplicity of the wise is more useful for life than eloquence.
So he's not just a neutral commentator. He's actively shaping how people understand Aristotle.
Yeah, he's got an agenda. And then there's his approach to Plato. He did this really interesting thing in his Hecatomia. He basically created a digest of excerpts from Plato's Laws and Republic. It's like a condensed, organized version of Plato's ethical and political thought. And he meant it as a companion to Aristotle.
Like a Cliff's Notes for Plato.
Kind of, yeah. But here's the thing. He included these little notes in the margins warning students about certain Platonic ideas that he thought were bad or went against Christianity, like that stuff in the Republic about communal ownership of wives and children. He basically presented this collection as Aristotle's Plato. He focused on the parts of Plato that Aristotle himself had discussed and found worthwhile. And he offered a Christian critique along the way.
So he was a careful curator of ancient wisdom.
Very much so. Okay, so what about metaphysics? The outline suggests that Lefèvre often avoided really digging deep into metaphysics.
Yeah, that's right. All over his commentaries, he'll point out the metaphysical implications of this or that idea, but then he'll just kind of drop it. He'll say stuff like, enough about this at this point. Like he's saying, this is really a matter for metaphysics or theology, which for him were pretty much the same thing. So he's part of that natural theology tradition that sees philosophy as studying the traces of the divine in the world.
Right. For Lefèvre, philosophy is ultimately pointing you toward theological understanding. And that allowed him to be pretty creative in how he brought different ideas together.
Yeah.
Some scholars have pointed out that what Lefèvre did for Aristotle was a lot like what Ficino did for Plato. He presented Aristotle as fundamentally in harmony with Christianity. He even went so far as to suggest that Aristotle might have prayed to the ensythema, the being of beings. And this idea of showing how Aristotle fits with Christian doctrine, that was really central to Lefèvre's whole project.
It was his mission.
It really was. Okay, so how did he handle Neoplatonism, which was also having a moment during the Renaissance?
Well, he believed in the essential harmony of all true knowledge. So while he was, you could say purifying Aristotle, making
Hmm.
his ideas as clear and consistent as possible, he was also looking for a metaphysical framework that could accommodate some Neoplatonic elements. He'd been interested in Neoplatonic texts early on, stuff like the Hermetic Corpus and De Magia Naturali, but later he got a bit more cautious about esoteric or magical interpretations.
Right. But his edition of Nicholas Acusa's complete works is really interesting here. Lefèvre saw Acusa as representing a truly Christian way of doing philosophy. He linked Cusa to earlier Christian Neoplatonists like Dionysius the Areopagite and the Victorines, and he even had this theory that pagan philosophers had basically ripped off Dionysius's ideas, which were Pauline and therefore, authentically Christian.
So Kusa was kind of the modern embodiment of this Christian philosophical tradition.
Yeah, that's how Lefèvre saw him. And he interpreted Cusa's idea of scienti divine ignoranti, the idea that the best way to know God is to recognize the limits of human understanding. He saw that as a faithful reading of Dionysius's apophatic theology, the idea of describing God by what he's not. So for Lefèvre, Cusa was this pivotal figure who brought together all these strands of Christian thought.
Okay, so last question. What about Lefebvre's legacy? I mean, everyone knows how important he was for biblical scholarship and the Reformation, but what about his influence on philosophy?
Yeah, his biblical work was huge, no doubt. But his impact on philosophy was also really deep, even if it played out in more subtle ways, like his editions of Neoplatonic works, the Hermetic Corpus, Pseudo-Dionysius, Cusa. Those were standard texts for centuries. And that focus on analogy, the idea that you can use analogies to connect truths in different fields that had it.